If telling people to just stop worrying worked, I'd be out of a job. Nobody wants to be trapped in chronic anxiety or have panic attacks. Now, did you know that anxiety and worry can be a habit? I never learned this in medical school. Yet when my lab studied this and found it to be true, it completely changed how I practice psychiatry. My name is Dr. Judd Brewer. I'm a psychiatrist and neuroscientist. I'm a professor at Brown University School of Public Health and Medical School. I've been developing and studying programs to help people break free from unhealthy habits ranging from smoking to overeating to anxiety for decades. My book, Unwinding Anxiety, was a New York Times bestseller. My TED Talk, The Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, has been viewed over 19 million times. I know a lot about anxiety, and I know how to help you step out of it. So if you're tired of fighting, you're feeling defeated or even hopeless because nothing else has worked, you're in the right place. Let's get started unwinding that cycle. Fear is helpful. That's because if we're in danger, fear helps us act right now. You've probably heard of this. It's called fight, flight, freeze. When faced with danger, we immediately gear up to fight, run away, or freeze in our tracks. Once we're out of harm's way, and this is the crucial part, we learn. Our brains apply the knowledge from that scary experience so we can avoid it in the future. This process is called negative reinforcement. Now, don't think negative means bad here. It means that we learn to avoid unpleasant experiences in the future. This is a key process in how we learn to adapt to our environment. Negative reinforcement has three essential components: a trigger or a cue, a behavior, and a result, or from a neuroscience standpoint, we call this a reward. Negative reinforcement works like this. Say you're walking down the street, you get a text, you start typing a reply. Suddenly you hear screeching tires, you look up and freeze. You've almost been hit by a car. You're okay, but that wave of adrenaline leaves you a little shaky. Once it subsides, that fear puts your brain into learning mode. Your brain says, wow, that was close. Let's find a way to avoid getting hit by a car in the future. So let's break down what your brain just learned. First, the cue or the trigger, you're about to cross the street. So what's the behavior? Put your phone away and look both ways before stepping into the street. And of course, what's the result? You cross the street safely. Now, you don't need to be scared out of your mind to learn through negative reinforcement. You simply need something unpleasant enough to get you to try different behaviors to make it go away or to avoid it in the future. Our brains are set up this way to avoid unpleasant things and situations in general. Once you learn what behavior works, you lay it down as a habit, so you don't even have to think about it anymore. When cued or triggered, you automatically do it. Here's another example. If someone offers you a food that you've never tried before and you don't like the taste, you learn pretty quickly to avoid it in the future. Pretty simple, right? But fear is different than anxiety. As you just saw, fear is a survival tactic that keeps us safe. It helps us react in the moment. It also motivates us to learn to avoid that threat in the future. But anxiety is born when fear meets another more sophisticated survival mechanism that came later in evolution, and that's planning. Now, we'll go over this more in detail in the next video, but basically fear and planning work like this. Your brain uses fear to learn from in-the-moment threats, but also your brain uses planning to help avoid future threats and seek future rewards. You'd think that adding two good things together would be even better. Unfortunately, that's not the case. In fact, everything goes wrong when fear and future are mushed together. That's when you get anxiety. Anxiety takes all of those what-if scenarios that can be helpful with planning, mixes in some fear, and then what happens? You start thinking about all of the worst-case scenarios, and instead of planning how to avoid them, you start worrying that they can and will happen to you. Anxiety is the product of fear looking too far ahead. Instead of focusing on immediate threat, that fear is applied to the future. That's what anxiety is in a nutshell: fear of the future. Does that make sense? Anxiety is fear of the future. In the next video, we'll go specifically into how anxiety works and why it really isn't your fault. For the vast majority of us in the modern world, we aren't in immediate danger every day. That gives us the luxury of planning for the future. And planning has its obvious advantages. You can break down big projects into smaller chunks, you can optimize travel plans, and so on. But where planning goes awry is the origin story for anxiety. Here's how it works. The part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex is responsible for this planning function. It's wired into us. Fear is also a natural built-in response. Yet fear responses come from an older part of the brain. Not to sound overly simplistic, but think of it this way. Our ancient ancestors really needed fear because they were very focused on the present moment, basically surviving the day to make it to tomorrow. Planning was nice, but not required. So the problem comes when these fear and planning systems mix. Fear is helpful, planning is helpful, but mixing fear and planning, really fear in the future, produces anxiety. It's what I think of as an evolutionary bottleneck. Our natural built-in systems, fear and planning, are adaptive in isolation, but they go haywire and short our brains out when mixed. Not only does anxiety not help us perform, it's bad for our physical and mental health as well. What? You might have read a blog on the internet or even a book that suggests that a little bit of anxiety is helpful, but too much is harmful. I hate to break it to you, but when you look at the research, there's no evidence that backs this up. You may have heard of the Yerkes-Dodson law that perpetuates this myth. This was based on a study from 1908, done in mice, Japanese dancing mice to be precise. The evidence in humans, regardless of whether we can dance or not, actually shows the opposite. The more anxious we are, the worse we perform at work and in life. Being a little anxious and performing well is not the same as anxiety being the key causal element in performing well. In my book Unwinding Anxiety, I go into details about this. I also discuss the opposite of anxiety, flow states, which is the real key to optimal performance. And people even describe flow as an optimal and even peak mental state as well. I've never heard a patient or anyone describe anxiety as an optimal mental state. If you've ever watched an Olympic athlete perform at their best, or have been in the zone yourself, you know what I mean. They, and you, are the farthest from feeling anxious. They're relaxed, they're dialed into the task at hand. So if anxiety isn't helpful, why do we get anxious in the first place? Well, this is where that evolutionary bottleneck comes in. Our brains don't like uncertainty. Having information helps us survive now and also helps us plan for the future. When we're uncertain about something, we get this restless, itchy urge to gather information. That's a good thing. For example, if it's late at night and you hear an unfamiliar sound in your house or your apartment, your brain goes into overdrive to try to figure out what caused it. Is that an intruder? Or is it a family member? Or just a pet? This is another way that fear helps us survive. We can't just roll over and go back to sleep not knowing what caused the noise. We have to go investigate so we can be certain of what it is and act accordingly. Fear helps us reduce uncertainty in the present moment so that we can fight, we can run away and call for help, or we can realize, oh, it's just my cat knocking something off the counter, and then we can go back to sleep. Yet what happens when we bring fear together with uncertainty of the future? We can't make future uncertainty go away. It's the future. We can only do our best to plan for it. When we flip from planning and start worrying about what might happen, it doesn't reduce the uncertainty. And here's an irony. It makes it harder to think and plan. Our prefrontal cortex is the youngest and weakest part of the brain. Ready for this? It goes offline when we're stressed or anxious. And then we're just stuck worrying about what might happen instead of being able to plan. Again, planning is helpful. And as you can see, anxiety, not so much. Now that we have an understanding of fear, planning, and anxiety, it's time to talk about what we can do to step out of anxiety cycles and free our brains to plan and even flow through the day. Some things make anxiety worse. Of course they do. If you're watching this, you already know that. But what are these factors and how do they interact with our brains to produce more anxiety? It's good to start with the architecture of anxiety. As a reminder, our brain's default processes, fear and planning, work well, but not so well when you mix them together. When we plan, we gather as much information and try to predict the future. This is our prefrontal cortex at work again, trying to process all the data we have to run all the possible scenarios so we can be prepared for what might happen, that's right, in the future. Once our brains have sufficient information, we can make choices about what's likely to happen, take action, and move on. That's right, we can plan. But our world of immense and omnipresent information disrupts this process. More is not always better. This is also the case for planning. Trying to constantly get more and more information can set us into a tailspin of analysis paralysis. Voila, worry and anxiety.